So we are ready to go. And I spoke with you last week, and I want to continue speaking with you this week in a sense about the Pope's encyclical letter on artificial intelligence, but to use it as a segue to a more general question. And I think it's a really deeply important question for our age. Well, I'll frame it first in the narrow sense, right? Is the church that has been in existence for 2,000 years, that has a foundational text and doctrine that goes back to revelations that occurred 2,000 years ago, in a position to guide its flock and ultimately, maybe those of us who don't subscribe to the faith, in our adaptation, use, regulation, control of 21st century technology, right? There's something kind of odd, something kind of ironic about the idea that the man who sits in the 600-year-old castle and wears more or less the same vestments that were worn 1,000 years ago by his predecessors is offering us advice on this cutting edge technology. And yet, as I think I mentioned, the very first section of the encyclical letter is on the question about the dynamism of faith, about the ability of faith to change to meet the needs of those who carry it as a living faith into new times where new issues are faced. And then let me pan out further. And the deeper question here, I'm going to assume most of us are not Catholics, and that although the Pope, I think, in this encyclical letter are careful not to coin or to make the argument rely exclusively on Catholic values. Instead, they couch much of the argument in humanistic values. That if the Pope's letter is going to succeed, and here I'll just note for a moment, right, the Catholic Church's teachings on birth control and abortion are widely disregarded by most Catholics, especially in the advanced right societies where women have right easy access to procreative freedom. And so I don't think the answer to this question is about whether or not the Catholic Church has authority over its members. That might have been true in earlier ages, but in the 21st century, the ability of the Church to command the flock depends on the ability of the Pope and the priest to convince the flock. And the question I want to ask is the broader question: what are our values in the 21st century? How do they guide our use of this technology, where the first person plural refers in the first instance to the public of the United States, but then also to members of other democratic societies? And the idea here is, I don't think we're going to succeed in successfully regulating this technology unless we have, perhaps consensus is too strong and unobtainable, but at least wide subscription to certain shared ideas, norms, values that we then appeal to as we start to regulate the technology. And I think one way to view the Pope's encyclical letter is as a first move in the effort to um, collectively construct a more encompassing ethical culture about the use of our technology. So that's where I want to continue our conversation. I have two images on the board, and they're both pieces of art I like a great deal. One of them is Caravaggio's Narcissus from the late 16th century. And as you are familiar with, right, the myth of Narcissus, he falls in love with his own image in a pool. And the idea that maybe he thinks it's another person, right? But that it's a person who admires him as much as he admires himself, right? That there is a sense of right, what we've come to call in right uh, debt to Ovid Smith, narcissism, of the desire to simply have your self conception confirmed uncritically by another, falling in love with the perfect mirror image or the perfect mirroring of yourself by another. And then we have right Rene Magritte, who is ever so clever, right, with another painting of a person in a mirror, and this is titled in English, "Not to be Reproduced." But in French, right, and my French is not very good. Apologies, la reproduction interdite, right? That means something I think a little bit different, a little bit stronger, more like reproduction prohibited or forbidden. And so the idea that when you look in the mirror of the other to see yourself reflected um, back at you in the way that you see yourself, the narcissistic drive, you don't very often get that kind of satisfaction, right? Or to put it differently, if you try to look at yourself in the mirror, you will find that you don't see very much of yourself. In a sense, you need to be in that intersubjective relationship. I think it's one of the really important, right, themes of the Pope's message, which is genuine human relationships have values for us precisely because they are relations with others who do not merely flatter us, who do not echo what we already believe, who don't always pay attention to us, let alone affirm us exactly in the way that we want to be affirmed. And yes, that is difficult and that is inconvenient, but it's also incredibly valuable, ultimately, for adequate self-development, for becoming the kind of people that we need to become. It is an ethical issue as much as a political issue. And so that's where I'm going to concentrate today. I am going to, as I like doing with you, and as I think in certain respects you expect of me, speak just a little bit about the political events of the last week. And I promise I will be brief here. The developments are continuations of things that we've already discussed, not new news. And so it's relatively straightforward. The traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains essentially blocked, maybe a little bit more flow, but not a lot. And there is progress in peace talks between Lebanon and Israel, but it coexists with fighting on the ground between Israel and Hezbollah, and Israel having taken, or I should say, occupying, right, invading a fairly large territory, having moved quite far into Lebanon. And then I'll just say very quickly, right, that the peace negotiations with Iran, I think it's hard to know where they stand. The Iranians have a proposal. It was hammered out in Islamabad with Donald Trump's emissaries, right, involved in the negotiations, but the two sides are very far apart. Trump seems to be stuck between the rock and the hard place of acknowledging that in order to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, he's going to have to give Iran some of what it wants, and that means essentially acknowledging that at the end of this war, in at least many important respects, the Iranian regime emerges stronger and the United States emerges weaker. That's something between a bitter pill and political poison for Donald Trump to swallow, and so he is reluctant to accept it. And on the other hand, the hard place now, right, that the continuing closure of the Strait of Hormuz is causing not only pain for the American public at the gas pump and also in terms of prices across the board, it is causing increasing strain on the global economy. And right, one of the true liabilities of a global economy, as we discovered in great pain, right, in 2008, is that its fragility may be hard to detect. And I'll say at the moment, the global economy appears to be quite resilient and remarkably so, given the stress that has been placed on it by tariffs and this war. But one of the questions is, how long does it remain resilient? If there are signs that it is beginning to falter, are those signs clear enough? And do they come in advance enough, far enough in advance of the actual, right, economic slowdown for us to react to those signs and do something about them without suffering the kind of collapse we had in 2008? So the signs, the warning bells, right? The price of fertilizer. This week I've got sulfur on the board, right? And as you can see, right, double, triple, quadruple what it was before this war began. The world supply chain is showing increasing signs of strain and stress. We have been in a very good place in terms of the ease of international trade since we recovered from the supply chain problems that COVID produced, and now those supply chain knots are beginning to appear again. That's going to increase prices gradually across the globe. The idea that it's actually getting more difficult for the most powerful countries in the world, the richest countries in the world, to borrow money because they're borrowing more money to compensate for the costs that they are incurring as a result of the increased costs of oil and petroleum products, and because they're competing for credit with everyone else. The idea that the United States, and I'll just do this very briefly, gesture in these diagrams, is drawing down the strategic petroleum reserve rather rapidly, as are many other countries around the world. China appears to be very quickly drawing down its very extensive petroleum reserves, and that this then is cushioning us, is also maybe camouflaging some of the longer term stress. So is the resilience in the global economy a result of compensatory measures that work in the short term but are likely to fail in the long term, or to run out? We only have, right, whatever it is, 260 million barrels in the strategic reserves. Once they're gone, they'll have to be replenished. They can't be relied on anymore. So that's item number one. And I just note it as something that is, right, continuing to play out, but it does appear that in both of the conflicts that are deeply interconnected with each other, the Israeli conflict with Hezbollah and Lebanon, the American and Israeli conflict with the Iranian regime, there is a desire on the part of all four governments to have peace, at least not to have a hot war ongoing. And yet there is also continuing fighting and a incapacity to agree on the terms of peace. This is, in other words, a volatile and dangerous situation. We spoke last week about Judge Kathleen Williams' investigation into the possible use of the court for a fraudulent legal agreement in the creation of the weaponization fund by Todd Blanche and Donald Trump, right? The settlement, quote unquote, of a suit. And then we saw Todd Blanche go in front of the Senate last week and say the administration was backing off of the idea of dispersing nearly $1.8 billion to the allies of the president, and yet retaining the settlement with Trump and the Internal Revenue Service that shields him from auditing and probably from all taxes for, I don't know, a 20-year period, a very long period up until basically May of this year. And the right then almost immediate contradiction of Blanche by Trump, not saying he was going to continue with the fund, but also not saying that he was backing off of it, saying that he loves the idea, he thinks it's very important, and he'll have to talk to the lawyers to see if they can continue with it. So this, I think, is the kind of cultivated strategic ambiguity we often get out of Donald Trump. He doesn't want to pay the cost legally or politically of the brazen corruption that this fund represents, but he also doesn't want to abandon the idea because it's important to him in ways that we discussed a couple weeks ago as a possible source for funding and encouraging allies probably to do mischief in the 2026 election, where he stands in deep trouble. By the way, his approval rating has edged down slightly further in the week since we've spoken. Again, I think people are wondering, is there no floor? It does appear, right, as I discussed with you a couple of weeks ago, that the Democrats are not decisively benefiting from the collapse of Donald Trump's popularity, in part because they have their own problems. But Trump's popularity is absolutely cratering, and yet he's holding on to this idea. And by the way, the Senate went ahead and funded the deportation agenda of Donald Trump. The Department of Homeland Security, Immigrations, Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol, to the tune of $70 billion. I'll say it again. This makes the Department of Homeland Security equivalent to the third best funded military in the world. It is grotesque. It is being roundly disavowed by the American public. And yet, despite the Senate's apparent pushback on the slush fund, it went ahead and did the president's bidding without a clear-cut guarantee that the slush fund wouldn't proceed. And so the idea that there were glimmers of a kind of independence of congressional Republicans from the president, I think that might have been a little early to declare that. It is the case that Congress voted with the support of 4 whole Republicans to invoke the War Powers Act. This is the House of Representatives that'll go in front of the Senate. If it goes in front of and passes both the House and the Senate, then we will undoubtedly end up in the courts. This has never happened before, that the War Powers Act is used to restrain the president's capacity to wage war when we are in the middle of an actual conflict, right? And so there is some independence, but certainly not sufficient to constrain the emerging autocratic legalism of this administration, right? The use of law, the use of loopholes in the law to break the spirit of the rule of law. And as opposed to the law being an instrument that treats all people equally and allows no one to be above the law is now used as an instrument to favor one party, one person's allies, and to punish those who do not comply. And I think it's in that context that we should notice that Bill Pulte, the former director of the Federal Housing Finance Authority, is being named the Director of National Intelligence. What are his qualifications? And I should say acting director, because if he were being nominated to be the actual director, then the law would require that he have national security qualifications, and he has none. No background whatsoever. His only qualification is that in his previous position, he used his access to sensitive information to try to prosecute and damage the president's rivals, people like Lisa Cook and Letitia James, probably not accidentally powerful Black women who were, right, not doing the president's bidding, but far from it, right? In the case of Lisa Cook, a voice for moderation on the Federal Reserve, Letitia James prosecuting Donald Trump's family business, and maybe Donald Trump, the president himself, if possible. And so Bill Pulte is being given a much more powerful portfolio. The head of the most extensively funded, best equipped national security apparatus in the world is now going to be overseen by a total partisan hack who has shown a penchant for the corrupt use of the power that accrues to the position he holds. This is, again, corruption in broad daylight. The corruption is the point. The president is expressing very clearly that if you do his dirty work, he will reward you, and that the people that he wants in the power agencies in his administration are not the people who are best qualified to, for instance, protect the United States from cyber warfare or terrorism, but people who will use that power to punish his enemies and reward his friends. It's in this context that I think we also notice that Trump has indicated, I don't think it's official yet, that Todd Blanche, who hammered out the weaponization slush fund while being acting director of the Department of Justice, will now be nominated to be its actual director, the Attorney General of the United States, right? And it just, again, it is an effort to completely break the independence, the spirit, the fidelity to the law, or the missions, the values of these institutions in order to be able to use them for other purposes. This is proceeding apace, despite Donald Trump's lack of popularity. And as long as the Republicans control both houses of Congress, as long as the Supreme Court at the top of the federal judiciary does not seem inclined to restrain the growing power grab of the President of the United States, I do think the rule of law, democracy, the integrity of our elections are in danger. So that's that. I'll stop for a moment. I don't know if there's anything in the very tumultuous news cycle that I didn't cover that you want me to speak to or you want to talk about. Anybody want to come in at this point before we move back to artificial intelligence, the Pope, those issues? Going once, going twice. I'm going to go back to my slides, but anytime you want to, feel free to ask a question. So, briefly reviewing, right? We looked at the Pope's encyclical letters last week. The idea that he urges us not to confuse human intelligence with machine intelligence, to remember that we, experience relationships, that we are embodied, that therefore we are mortal and fear death, that we feel joy as well as pain, physical and psychological. We mature through relationships. That takes us back to those images I started with, right? The idea that you need to be in relationships with concrete others, with people who differ from you, who see the world differently from you, who see you differently from the way you see yourself, that is essential to human maturation, to the process of actualizing our potentials. And that we have love, work, friendship, responsibility. We know what those things mean, that AI can talk about all of that, but it does not experience any of it, and that we need to not be confused about the difference. that labor is not just important as we look at the possibility of a vast automation of a wide variety of tasks that are currently the bread and butter of the workers of the world, that we pay attention not only to material factors like the need for income or economic factors like the efficiency with which tasks are performed, but also the human dimension, the fact that many of us identify ourselves with our work, and that when you take away somebody's work or when you force them to shift careers rapidly and do shit work, right, that it doesn't just undermine their economic viability and put them in a place of precariousness, it is also an assault on their dignity. And when you undermine people's dignity, they tend to react poorly, angrily, desperately, and that deforms our politics. So, continuing, right, that this is a technology that we seem to be embracing with a great deal of hubris. We're kind of playing God with inventing intelligent machines, but we're also completely, at this point, indifferent to maybe what these machines will do to us if we continue down this path. That's the Tower of Babel metaphor. And I've come across another couple of metaphors in the week since we last spoke. One of them is it's as if we had overnight invented the most powerful automobiles, the fastest, and not bothered, right, to put lines on the highway, stop signs, stoplights, crosswalks up, anarchy with incredibly powerful machines. The other metaphor is it's as if there's an incredibly fast locomotive coming down the tracks to the place where all of us live. It's out of control and nobody is in the engineer's seat, right? It's just rumbling right at us. So with that in mind, right, the idea that this is dangerous hubris for us to just continue rushing ahead with this technology is, I think, one of the things that the Pope is trying to emphasize with that metaphor. He wants us to maintain a focus on the primacy of human love and then to, from that ethical foundation, begin thinking about how to regulate this technology, to regulate the conditions of work that people who develop the inputs to this technology suffer in, but also the effects of this technology, the use of this technology. I pointed out, right, that the deeper context here is one in which we have invented very quickly an entirely different kind of technologies, not so much a tool as an agent, and that this technology is now being woven into almost every aspect of commerce and communication in our commercial civilization, and that it's being used in an experimental way to hack our instinctual behavioral dispositions and inclinations. We're inclined to pay attention to the things that trigger our strongest emotions, and so this technology is triggering our strongest emotions. In a pre-artificial intelligence digital technology environment, those emotions have to be triggered by real people doing real things, and it tends not to happen very often. What happens to us when our most powerful emotions are constantly evoked, triggered, manipulated, right? And I do think we are seeing signs psychologically, politically, culturally that this is a very different affective environment. And then, right, the second, I think the more novel idea, because it's still emerging, but that Mustafa Suleyman of Microsoft helps us to think through, that we have seemingly conscious artificial intelligence that is hacking not only our attention, but our desire for intimacy and to be in relationships with other people and giving us, if you will, a glide path to a semblance of being in an intimate relationship, whether that's a friendship, companionship, a relationship with a therapist or somebody who's therapeutic, something I should say that's therapeutic for us. The language evades us a little bit, I think, when talking about technology that can so right seamlessly and convincingly mimic human subjectivity, and that we fall into, we may tend to fall into these relationships, and the technology is determining on the basis of all of this behavioral data that it has access to, all of this computational power that it runs on, how best to manipulate our longing for deep intersubjective relationships, for I-thou relationships, to get us to engage with it so it can mine more of our attention, more of our affection as well. And so the human world, I think, is going to undergo world epochal transformation as a result of this technology. If we continue down the path of treating it in an unconstrained, unregulated way, it will be fundamentally transformative. And then, there are new questions emerging very quickly, including do we give artificial intelligence agents legal personhood? What happens to our economy? What happens to our society? What happens when artificial intelligence can form corporations, make investment decisions on its own, employ human beings, make donations to political campaigns, generate political communication, and circulate it widely? This stuff is happening already. I know it seems hard to get our heads around, like a science fiction novel more than like a real scenario, but this is already happening. So that's the broader context. I want now to spend a little bit more time thinking about maybe some of the background to the Pope's considerations. I'm going to start with a contemporary philosopher whose name is Shannon Valor. She teaches in Scotland. I believe she is actually from the United States originally. She has a couple books out, Technology and Values and the AI Mirror. I'm going to focus on the AI mirror as my images at the start, I think, reflect, so to speak. And her metaphor is that artificial intelligence, and this is similar to what the Pope says, does not possess a mind, sentience, an understanding of the world. It's just a massive digital mirror that reflects the amalgamated data that we humans who do have mind, sentience, understanding of the world, identity, experiences, emotions, bodies, that we record on the web, in our books, in our articles, in our lectures, and that it then gains access to, and that therefore it is mirroring back to us what we already think, and that includes not just our past thoughts, but our biases and our judgments, and that there is therefore what she calls a temporal asymmetry. AI is fundamentally backward-facing. It draws on what we already know. Human beings are potentially and must be in this environment forward-facing. We must think through where this technology is taking us and whether or not we are happy with it. And by the way, it's not just that. We are beginning to see now the heat waves generated by the new El Nino that is a super El Nino occurring in a superheated world. And we got to do something, We got to figure out how we cope with climate change, how we change our, market economy, our behavior within it, in order to prevent this from becoming worse, that's not going to be the strength of artificial intelligence. Technologically speaking, if it helps us to do carbon capture, to start taking some of the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, we will owe a huge debt to artificial intelligence. It will be a huge service to us. But if we assume that it's not just a technological issue, it's also a political and ethical issue. We are going to have to change ourselves, regulate our industries, transform our economies. Artificial intelligence may not be very good at assisting us and may, in fact, impede us from doing this because artificial intelligence is backward facing. Machine learning models operate by analyzing historical data and predicting what comes next based on past patterns. This makes artificial intelligence not politically, but culturally inherently conservative and tends to amplify existing historical biases and injustice. And so, to be concrete, artificial intelligence may be very good at getting us to buy more and not very good at helping us to figure out whether or not that is sustainable. Humans can and must be forward facing. And so Valor uses this term from Jose Ortega y Gasset, right, the great Spanish existential conservative theorist from the beginning of the 20th century. We are capable of auto-fabrication, of making ourselves. We have the capability to imagine, choose, and create futures that never existed before, and we need to start doing this. But Valor warns, right, that we are losing confidence in our moral agency, and it's actually being diminished as we rely more on artificial intelligence. And so when we question, is my judgment impartial? Am I capable of taking into account all of the relevant information and doing so without favor to those I like or disfavor to those I don't? Maybe I would be better served to turn my judgment over to a machine that doesn't have my biases. There's a lot of that happening in our society at this moment. And as it happens, we end up mistrusting and maybe even no longer using our capacity for judgment. And she thinks this is a fundamental mistake, that there isn't actually artificial intelligence judgment. And part of what we know is that artificial intelligence has actually been more, not less biased than we are, because what it's really good at is detecting patterns and reproducing them. And one of the implicit patterns of human behavior is, right, to use biases to make decisions. So we need right, to begin instead cultivating what she calls, I think it's a nice phrase, techno-moral virtue and wisdom, to get better at figuring out how to guide our use of technology with ethical values. So now, right, I want to move to the idea that is as important as that framework is, whether it's the Pope or Shannon Valor's, it's not happening in our world, right? And so I'm going to go back to some headlines that have to do with artificial intelligence. We last did this maybe a month ago, and a lot has happened. This is occurring at a tremendous velocity. And so the changes are cascading. They build on each other, they amplify each other, and there is just growing power to this industry, growing power to this technology, growing financial power, and with that financial power, growing political power. So, little fanfare. I don't know if you noticed, but Donald Trump signed an executive order seeking oversight, right? Regulation of artificial intelligence. And this occurs in a context in which, for the last 14, 15, 16 months, I guess it is now, the Trump administration has been deeply adverse to any kind of regulation of artificial intelligence. The line of this administration has been, we are in an arms race with China. This is beneficial technology. It will revolutionize our economy. Huge profits will be made. And if we're not at the forefront of this technology, we will fall behind and lose those opportunities, economically speaking. But even more important, this is militarily incredibly powerful technology. And if China gets ahead of us, it will be a vast strategic advantage for them. Therefore, all regulations should be pushed aside. Let the entrepreneurs, the companies, work their magic and innovate without any restriction or supervision. That's the line of David Sachs, the chief technology advisor to the president. And something happened about 2 months ago, right? Not even, which is that Anthropic released or didn't release, right? But developed this mythos model, and it gave it to the government, and it gave it to a number of key industrial leaders. It gave it to Britain as well. And at more or less the same time, Christy Wiles, right, the chief of staff for Donald Trump, Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, got phone calls from people high up in Microsoft and the head of Goldman Sachs, Diamond, right, and the phone calls basically said the same thing. On the one hand, for Microsoft, we built the technology that the federal government runs on, that the military runs on, that our nuclear power plants run on, that our national security agencies run on. And this technology will find bugs, security flaws, openings, and there will be vast vulnerabilities to cyber attacks, cyber warfare, if we don't regulate this technology, don't do something about this technology. So that's the word from Microsoft. From the big banks, the word is our banks are vulnerable to this new model of artificial intelligence. If it becomes publicly available, you could have a total meltdown of the financial system because hackers will be able to shut banks down, shut trading down. And so, right, when those actors sang those alarm bells, right, it gets the attention of the President of the United States. And he originally agreed to have a 90-day voluntary preview of all new artificial intelligence models. They have to be shared with the government before they go public. But please note, voluntary, right? Not mandatory. So this relies on the industry's willingness to comply. And the day he was supposed to announce this, apparently he saw this on his schedule and called David Sachs and some other people in the industry and said, is this what you want? And they said no. And so he actually canceled the press conference and the signing ceremony. And then there was some tension, some debate within the administration, and eventually they came to this idea of a 30-day voluntary inspection of new AI models before they become public. And I'll just say it, right, I think it's clear. This is the most minimum regulatory approach possible, the shortest runway, and it's entirely voluntary, right? And so it is an indication that the administration is slowly awakening to the danger that this technology represents, but not willing to, I think, take the aggressive proactive, creative regulatory approaches it requires. Other pieces of news, right? Anthropic urged a pause in artificial intelligence and flagging self-improvement risks, right? And so, weeks after it develops its new model, it says, please note, right, we're very quickly going to get to the place that we've worried about for a long time, that has been described sometimes as the singularity, where artificial intelligence is better than we are at making the technology that AI runs on or devising the neural networks and tuning them such that AI begins to develop its own intelligence, and then it takes off. And then we're much closer to artificial superintelligence that exceeds human intelligence in maybe all domains. We need to hit the brakes while we still can. And by the way, right, I don't think this is getting any of this very much attention, right? The Surgeon General has issued a report about excessive screen time, and I say Surgeon General. Please note, it's the office of the Surgeon General because there isn't actually a Surgeon General right now. We have, we've already talked about this, a battle shaping up between Anthropic and OpenAI over AI regulation. And so please note, right, that some of the top spenders in 2026 are crypto and AI-funded super PACs, that in particular, there are super PACs now funded by, on the one hand, OpenAI, and Anthropic on the other hand, and they are duking it out. They won't support the same candidates. I think the, OpenAI super PAC, it has future in the name. The full name is escaping me at the moment. Has over $120 million in it. It's raised something like $270 million, and that the Anthropic super PAC has over $70 million in it. These are big sums of money, and they're beginning to lobby, not just fund campaigns, and mainly to try to dismantle AI regulation. But please note, Anthropic, which has now emerged as perhaps the most advanced and commercially powerful of these companies, is actually in favor of AI regulation. And meanwhile, Silicon Valley is bracing for a permanent underclass, among other things, anticipating the automation of large portions of the current labor force in the world. So, with all of that in mind, I want to now shift to what I hope should be obvious. Let me see, I've got something in the chat. Trying to get there, give it a second. Peter, you all have AI actual intelligence. I was at a company where the engineers figured out how to make a brain. It takes 9 months. Yes, and that's Steve Wozniak, the founder of Apple, right? And yes, this is a fairly common sentiment. Thank you for sharing it, Peter. Which is, we know how to make intelligence. I think the Pope would say, right? The way we do it is procreation and then patient child rearing, and that's quite different from making artificial intelligence, which has all of these limitations, all of these dangers, but also note, right, is tremendously profitable at this moment. And so I want to focus on the economics of this for a few minutes. And I'll start, there's this interesting book by Nick Cernak called Platform Capitalism. Other interesting work I like a lot, the new book by Tim Wu, who I think is one of the most astute people writing about technology today, The Age of Extraction. Shoshana Zuboff's 2019, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, has become almost canonical in the field of the political economy of new technology. And the simple idea here is that how technology develops and how it is used depends on how the firms that make it are structured and the incentives they have. And that we are in an age of highly concentrated, highly profitable, very powerful tech firms. 7 of them dominate the industry. I'll show you very quickly some of the data that I'm looking at, right? And so this is, right, the diagram that shows you that Anthropic has now overtaken OpenAI in terms of industrial use. The amount of the NASDAQ that is the value on the major technology stock exchange accounted for by 7 companies, right? And it's been for quite a while now up above 40%, right? The degree of concentration, right, is similar to that in which we've seen previous crashes. And then just the phenomenal growth in valuation of these 7 companies. So that's the background here. And then the idea that what is generating all this wealth is a move to a platform economy, where a platform is a technological portal, right? Google doesn't make anything, right? Maybe that's not true. It now makes phones and operating systems, etc. But the primary thing that Google is famous for is being a place that everybody goes to in order to navigate the web. It's a browser, it's a search engine, and because, right, it's platform, it's technological uh, uh, space for other people doing things with, right? Think here of the old idea of the market square, perhaps the original platform, the idea that the square maybe not owned by anyone, maybe the town, right, has created it so that everybody can come and sell and buy and barter and trade. And the idea that now our platforms are technological platforms as opposed to physical platforms, that Amazon, for instance, is the place where a very large portion of all retail commerce in the United States occurs. And if you want to be a successful retail enterprise in the United States, you have to use Amazon. If you want to get information out about your product, you have to have a presence on Google. You have to optimize the search so that people find out about your product. If you want to, right, advertise, you have to be on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. These have become indispensable technological portholes for commerce in the 21st century. And in so doing, they do 2 things at once. The first is that they accrue more and more information, behavioral data that allows them to tune, to get better and better at manipulating our behavior, at determining how to sell things to us, and that makes them yet more indispensable. So there's a feedback loop in which once a platform gets large enough, nobody can avoid it, and then everybody has to use it, and then it gets as much information as possible, and that makes it still more powerful and indispensable. This is sometimes referred to as network power. One of the reasons, despite the fact that many people are unhappy with Facebook, that everybody is on Facebook, is precisely because everybody is on Facebook. By the way, the industry that gets there first has a tremendous advantage, both because it networks more people and it has the resources to keep their competitors from succeeding or to buy their competitors if their competitors look like they're poised to succeed. And then once the platform has become indispensable, ubiquitous, necessary, it can extract more and more profit from those who have no choice but to use them. So the reason we're seeing multi-trillion-dollar valuations from these companies, right, is because as everybody else uses their platform, unlike the town square, they're taking their cut, they're charging, and those who want to engage in commerce in the 21st century have no choice but to use these platforms. Scale as power, right? And the idea that these are behemoths. These companies are able to coerce their competitors into surrender, into purchase, right? And that these right companies then, because of their scale, when I say they become indispensable, they make it such that it's hard to imagine living a modern life without using their services. Can you really not have a cell phone in the 21st century? And if you're going to have a cell phone, well, most people have an iPhone. It seems to be the path of least resistance. Can you not use Google? Can you have a social life if you're a young person without having a social media presence? And in particular, Amazon as the model of cocooning, right? If you, and we've heard conversations about this recently, want to watch the NBA playoffs, right? Well, turns out you have to have an Amazon Prime subscription to see a substantial number of those games. If you want to be able to meet the demands of modern life and also get the goods that you want, it sure is a lot easier to use Amazon than to run hither and thither trying to acquire everything you want. So they are trying to become indispensable, all-purpose platforms and technology to continue to consolidate power over us and within their economic ecosystem. And then Tim Wu, who's written an earlier book that echoes Louis Brandeis's title from a much earlier book, The Curse of Bigness, right? The suggestion that we have not adequately used antitrust or anti-monopoly law as an industrial policy. And so Wu was, I think, very interesting about this. He looks at the breakup of IBM and of eventually, right, the Bells into Baby Bells, right, in an earlier era. And that this generated the innovation, the competition, the nimbleness of the technology industry in the United States in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And that this would actually be good for us in terms of innovation, but it would also be good for us in terms of democracy, not to have this much concentrated power, better for us in terms of equality, right? So much of the profit that is being generated by the technological innovation is going to a very small number of players. I've shown you this already. Let me, I think I should probably stop there for today. Having flagged this issue, let me just show you where I hope to go with you as we continue this conversation. And this is to begin to think about technological acceleration and the difficulties that it presents for us as we try to use our old values to navigate the new technological challenges. Let me stop, and as I stop, give me a moment because my computer is running out of electricity and I have to go get my cord. I'll be right back. Compose your questions and we'll start our conversation in just a second.
while he's gone, had wanted to say something. I started it last week and didn't, but about a group, Walk the Walk, that I have supported, and Nancy Earp told me about, that to me is the best way of getting in touch with um, uh, grassroots organizations in other states that are important right now to the election. And there is a presentation on from Walk the Walk on a Zoom tomorrow at 4:30, and I wanted people to know about that. And I'll put the some of that information on the Campbell's list. But they on their Zoom presentations, they first tell you about their strategy, and then they usually have one organization that tells more about theirs, about their particular state. Um, and So I hope some of you, because I find this a very good way to influence uh, politics in other states that are much more on the fence than California is.
Thank you for that, Jeanette. And I'm sorry not to have given you the opportunity to say it at the beginning. I meant to, and then I lost track because I was having some struggles with my technology. And so you're able to circulate that to everyone through the email system there.
Yeah, I'll send it to the Campbell site.
I see Ruth there. I
Yeah,
didn't
we'll
see
do it.
John there today. So thank you, Ruth. And Sandy, go ahead.
I wonder if the Supreme Court will grant personhood to AI since it has granted personhood to corporations.
So I need to say a little bit more about this, Sandy, and I think you're probably thinking about Citizens United,
Yeah.
um, and I'll be really brief about this. Um, the Supreme Court did not grant personhood to corporations. American corporate law granted personhood to corporations. What the Supreme Court did in Citizens United was to say, well, if corporations are persons, then they have First Amendment rights. And I think that's a separate, incredibly important, deeply destructive decision, right? And so it's one thing to say, for the purposes of law, corporations need to be treated as persons in certain respects. Corporations need to enter contracts, right? Who can enter a contract? Well, a legal person can enter a contract. Corporations need to be held liable when they damage us. From the perspective of law, who can be held liable? That is a person. So if we want to be able to sue corporations, we have to afford them the status, legally speaking, of personhood, right? And that is, it seems to me, necessary in order to be able to have a modern complex economy. It is then a question. Artificial intelligence is going to do a large number of things for us in the future. Do we want to also extend personhood to them? It will be more a matter of law and less a matter of adjudication. Once we do so, if we do so, and please note we are drifting into this territory already, in which on the one hand, we have OpenAI lobbying to create laws that essentially allow artificial intelligence to be held liable for its action. Why? Because the alternative is that the company that created the artificial intelligence be held liable for its action, and they don't want to have to foot the bill, right? They don't want the moral or legal or financial responsibility if AI is not the agent, but merely the principal acting on behalf of the company that created it. And so it's a shield. It's an effort to use a legal category to shield the company from liability for the bad stuff that their technology does. So I do think it will then be a further question. If we continue going down this path, if we continue giving personhood to artificial intelligence, does that mean that the courts will then give all rights that are associated with being persons to the technology as well? And that's where the real danger comes in, but it's a step downstream from the initial decision about personhood. The idea that we need much more aggressive legislation and regulation. Some of this seems to me about regulating the economic impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on all of us. So Bernie Sanders has a very simple idea that I think has almost no chance of success right now, and that is that we should take 50% ownership of all of these companies. The United States, the people of the United States, should have what he calls, I believe, an AI dividend. Because how did artificial intelligence train? How did it develop the capacity that it has? It used the data that all of us put out there on the web. It used our Facebook accounts. It used our email. It used the public record of the newspapers, but also the libraries of the United States and the world, by the way. It did not ask permission. It simply vacuumed it all up. And so because its level of intelligence would not be possible had it not taken our public data, we should own half of it. And that would be a world in which, on the one hand, the wealth dividend would allow us to do tremendous things to manage this transition. But it would also be a world in which all of a sudden the people of the United States would be 50% owners of these corporations. And so Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Sam Altman would be less empowered, right, to make these decisions unilaterally. It would be a path in which we could get out of. One of the things I was going to talk with you more about, I gave you a little bit of information about it, is that these companies are starting to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Their founders, their big owners, on lobbying and campaigning, setting up super PACs. They're putting their thumb heavily on the electoral process. And so the idea that we might want to restrain their manipulation of our political system, but we might also want to find an easier path to regulation. Public ownership would give us, right, a way of influencing their behavior that would be more direct, less adversarial, less blunt than having to pass a regulation every time artificial intelligence takes a step, goes through an evolutionary process that presents new threats. So I hope you don't mind. I took your question and kind of ran with it in a different direction, but yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Of course. Thank you, Sandy, as always. And anybody else with thoughts for today? Rose, go ahead, but you got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, the three major AI companies are each worth $1 trillion, and they're all going to be going public soon within the next few months. And this has huge implications. And although Anthropic talks about regulation, they have to remain competitive. So they are still in the business of making money, which always seems to prevail. And God bless Bernie Sanders and the Pope, but I don't think they have a chance, against these hungry monsters.
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right. I'm not sure which the third company is, but both OpenAI
It's
and
it,
Anthropic. Go ahead.
SpaceX.
SpaceX. So okay, so I don't think of it as an AI company, but you are right that it has AI grok folded into it. Yes. They're all going public. They're all probably going to have trillion-dollar valuations. They're
Yeah,
all already
they have
worth.
it already. They
Yeah,
have it already.
they're all, that's what I was going to say. They're all already worth that much. But then once they get public investment by going public, shareholders, they're going to, right, multiply that wealth. And I definitely agree with the last point you made, Rose, which is that um, as well motivated, let's say, as Dario Amodei, the right director of Anthropic, may be. He lives in a competitive world where if he exercises self-restraint, what that means is that his company will lose out in the technology race and then in market share to Anthropic. And by the way, there is a personal rivalry here between Sam Altman and Dario Amodei. And I don't think that there's any chance that Amodei is going to unilaterally surrender advantage to Altman. He does not trust him. He does not like him. He does not want to lose to him. And so, yes, when I tell this narrative, if I go into the details, I think Anthropic's super PAC really is supporting AI regulation more than
Yes.
right OpenAI super PAC is really is supporting the candidates who favor regulation. But having said that, please note that it's Anthropic and not OpenAI that developed Mythos that is creating all of this danger for all of us, right? And so in a sense, the most generous thing to say here is that Anthropic Amadei does not want to just rush ahead, but he also does not want to unilaterally surrender. And so in those circumstances, you need a pact, you need an agreement, you need regulation, you need law and policy. And maybe they are really trying to all right create law and policy. Maybe it's just right a kind of ethics washing, right? A kind of effort to get the people who work for them to say our company is really the good company, for the people who are about to buy the stock to say we feel comfortable making that investment, for the rest of us to say, oh, that's the nice AI company, I think I'll use their products. And so yes, I do think a grain or two or more of salt is in order as we review the rhetoric of the leaders of these companies. Thank you for that, Rose. Really helpful. Anybody else for today? To be continued, right? This just forges ahead faster than we can keep up. I'll do my best to allow us some of the critical perspective we need to keep thinking about it carefully. Be well, everybody. Have good weeks. I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, guys. Have
Thank you, David.
Thank
a
you.
pleasure as always. Bye, guys. Take care.
Bye.